we avoided all the triggers. It's just a little, okay, let's have a cup of tea now, right? So so looking at it in a different way and accepting that I am triggered sometimes and empathizing across that and building structures to harvest the knowledge you gain there is how I would cope with that. Does anybody else have other things? I saw 2 more hands back there. Thoughts? No? Okay. 1, and then 2, the lady in front of it. 1, go. Gotcha.
So the question was about when people we know do things that we're concerned about for them, or something's going to happen to them. This is brought up in relation to, in the psychedelic community, all really intelligent people with a lot of curiosity to explore all sorts of places, but we have concerns about some of those ways they're exploring. I was thinking about this earlier today about how I want to approach things like that, and I just sat with myself. How do I actually feel? I realized I just plain feel when I see someone like that, someone in a situation like that, I feel uncomfortable, and I was like, can I just name to this person, you know what? When you do this, I feel really uncomfortable, because I'm worried about you, and not telling them to stop. Maybe we should. Maybe that's another thing we can do. But it's the place to start from is, how do I feel? Because they can't really. They're not going to question that. There's not much they can get defensive about in relation to your own feelings. Probably a bunch of people here have some background in nonviolent communication. It's similar, same kind of underlying perspective, except that stuff's usually about what we want from the other person or what we're having troubles with that they're doing and how it affects us. But this is just plain concern.
I have an idea. Go ahead.
One thing that came up during the encounter group portion of the evening was trying to communicate a sense of trying to help. So if you're approaching someone who, is very intelligent, capable, curious, to share with them that you're not wanting to put them down. You're wanting to do something that will make them better, make their life better. And so having that positive framing can be really beneficial.
I appreciate what both of you said just now, and especially the notion of sharing one's personal feelings. There's another take that I have on the question, and it has to do with our culture's, it seems to me sometimes a blanket endorsement of all such exploration. We live in a culture, a larger legal framework that scarcely understands it all, puts down, makes wrong, criminalizes, suppresses information, propagates misinformation. It's pretty bad out there. And therefore, when we're on the inside, entre nous, There's a tendency to not do anything that looks like what the dominant culture is doing. And not all of those explorations actually seem to me to be healthy, wholesome. The quest of going from peak to peak to peak, oh, that one's over, I'm going to do another one, oh, the next weekend, oh, the next night, that does not seem always to be a healthy pattern to me. And one thing we can do is simply stop reinforcing it. It gets reinforced when we say, ooh, that's cool. Oh, what's that new alphabetamine you found? Tell me about it. Oh, where'd you get it? Oh, can I get some? That's so cool. Yeah, so a long-term thing is maybe we all just tamp it down a little bit.
We got about 5 more minutes for this portion, just heads up.
And I just wanted to put in one last there. As the scientist, especially if I'm engaging, I've been in an entheogenic community where I've had this exact concern before, and my approach was to engage with it as a scientist. And so my real conversation framed around, so what's your dose rate? So what's your anchor plan? So what's your self-care plan for that? What are your levels of this neurochemical and that neurochemical? And like really engaging in it, not in a judgmental way, but in a really speaking the language, staying within that space, but really bringing the science and the facts underneath it so that you can have a grounded, objective conversation in what is most often a really subjective topic. So bringing that lens and both the validity of that lens, like I'm not dissing you, I'm talking exactly about this really deep, beautiful thing we're talking about here, but I'm lending facts to it. I'm bringing it back to numbers, levels, LD50s, that type of stuff. So that's one way I would approach it. And there was a question there. Yeah. Share.
Triggers. So we were talking about, for instance, self-knowledge and how that can be like really, really critical before we approach other people with feedback. So I really loved how you guys also put like self before community, because there's always this self-knowledge is what enables us to even like think about where is the trigger coming from, why are we getting triggered, and how do we really feel about this, and that gives us information to then approach the other person, right? So the importance of doing the inside, the internal and the external, because community seems to be external, but there's a lot of like the internal aspect of community I really want to highlight now.
So just to paraphrase real quick for the camera, so that was about the importance of the knowledge of self and self-reflection before bringing it to community, and the intersection and connectedness of community and individual, and how that's both together. And what else? Shadow work. Ooh, what? 10 words about that.
Being really willing to make a relationship with parts of yourself that you would ordinarily exclude or not allow into the conversation in your everyday life. So the dark aspect of yourself.
Definitely. Not being afraid to look in the dark side of the mirror and even embrace what you find there in the service of a greater self. Yeah.
And the other thing that has come up, and that's something that I think a lot about, is the question of diversity and dissent. Because a lot of the times in the Bay Area community, we are built, like communities are built on values of love and unity, or these values are sometimes interpreted almost as homogenization. So what do we do? Like, at what point can we, or how do we recognize that there's actually a lot of different stories and histories and values and all of that in this community? And we were talking about process being a crucial aspect as well. Erica mentioned this whole process of forming, storming, and norming, and it was like, it's being an enforcement after that. Like, how can we make sure that there's a process that is going on?
So the kind of interplay between diversity and dissent in non-homogenous and perhaps sometimes homogenizing communities, and also the forming, storming, and norming, which is a great acronym or process code phrase. There were a lot of other great process code phrases and acronyms, etc., that I heard going around the room. I wish we could maybe write them all up on the board, because I know there's 3 new ones I learned, so that's awesome.
I was wrong. We have like 12 more minutes.
I was just wondering.
So what do you do when there's someone who's aligned, bought into change, really excited about it, and is not demonstrating capacity to change, and is not able to change, and really perhaps floundering or not moving forward in change? I've been in a situation with a community before in this particular way, and I can just share how we dealt with it. First, we really started by grounding ourselves with the knowledge that it is not only not our job, but not within our capacity to change any other person, right? You can't fix someone. You can't change someone. The only person that can change someone is themselves. And to run some actual emotional work under that so that we as a group became not so invested in their healing that we got in the way of it. We needed to kind of accept that whether they succeeded or failed was not our job or our fault, but rather our job was to provide support and to provide a dialogue and to model the right behavior, but we can't actually change that person, and to be okay with that. Because sometimes communities can... you can get a lot of sense of failure or like a big letdown if you've put all this work into having a really hard conversation and then that person is like, yes, and then nothing happens. That can be a big downer, right? Oh God, what happened there? Why bother speaking up again? And so it's really important to come to that conversation from the right place, knowing that you can't change it, but but acting right is important, and not just for you, but for your community modeling group. So there's that, and then other things are we ended up paying for outside additional assistance. So we paid for them to seek some counseling in one way. We also set really stringent community modeling guidelines around what their behaviors in this person, their substance of trouble was alcohol. So in alcohol serving situations, they always had to have a buddy, and their buddy was their non-alcohol drinking buddy, and they made fancy cocktails that were non-alcoholic together. And if they didn't have that buddy, they weren't allowed to come to the party. And those types of little social structures that helped them. And then most of the time it was just up to them. And sometimes in one case that led to a not so graceful exit of that person from the community, but the community was stronger for it. And in another case, that person slowly developed the capacity to change. And they very much developed that in community, and it ended up making the community stronger as a result of that. But it took work, a lot of work. Anybody else have other thoughts? Go. Yeah.
So, along the lines of that, having a buddy thing to help somebody out, there was a remark that struck me from Richard Feynman's autobiography, where he was on the commission that was investigating the Challenger spaceship blowing up. And he thought he had the answer about why, which was the O-rings or something. But he wasn't handling the politics right. And he had a buddy on the committee who was some guy from the Air Force or whatever, and the guy, when he would screw up in the committee, the guy would kind of lean over and whisper or pass him a note that says, co-pilot to pilot, do this, do it this way. Yeah. And it's you're in charge, you're running your own life, but I'm your co-pilot, and I'm suggesting doing something different.
So having a co-pilot or a context-specific advisor, and enlisting or inviting someone to be in that role, or perhaps mandating that someone in your community needs to have someone in that role, and would they please choose someone now? Yeah. One and then two. Go.
Have you guys had any examples of communities that you've been part of where the community started out with a culture that did not provide for regular feedback? So when we talk about that in our group, is that people just don't give feedback, and so it builds up as something that's really serious and that people go up, and that it would be a lot easier if there were regular gone from a culture of not really talking about things to implementing practices that led to an actual culture of being able to share?
Got anything in those 27 years?
I'm thinking about different communities.
Yeah.
Different.
One thing that helps. Go, bring it.
Yeah, so the question is about how do you go from a community that is bad at sharing feedback to taking that same group and helping it sort of incubate and grow to be one that's good at sharing feedback. Does that sound about right? One thing that I've found to be incredibly helpful with that, which many people I've been in community with are really resistant to, is emotional check-ins during group meetings, usually at the end. And I found that builds so much rapport and so much opportunity for that. I don't know, it's not everybody's thing. I don't know how to make one that's more inclusive for people who really struggle with those kind of check-ins.
I've been in communities where there was active resistance to those kind of emotional check-ins. Very active resistance. A community where that did exist, and then things got really busy. They disappeared. Some new people for a while. New people came in, and then they didn't come back because there was a lot of resistance. And what I've seen start to work is when subgroups within the community start to do things in ways that are visible to other people, which can start to slowly over time potentially shift norms and shift the contexts in which others feel safe. Because a lot of this is about safety. People don't want to do emotional check-ins because they don't feel safe. People don't want to have these kinds of systems or feedback loops or emotional, broader contexts for dealing with some of these deeper feelings. Well, that's often because they don't feel safe. So what builds safety? It's not necessarily just the context in terms of the moment, but the context over time of what they've seen among others.
One thing that I've seen that really, so I do this work a lot I often come into communities that have a baseline of, we don't talk about it until it's a crisis, because then they're in crisis and they need a facilitator. So I often come into these communities, and the first thing I often try to do that is amazingly successful is I try and reflect a mirror back to the community, specifically on this one front. I'm like, okay, show me what it looks like for something to be big enough for you to talk about it, and show me what that looks like in yourself and in your organization. And then once we put that up on the board, and we spend this much time and energy talking about it per day, or there's this much portions of meetings that happens, or I spend on average about 20 minutes a day processing with my coworker about how this sucks, that type of thing. Once we can put all that up on the board, and we can kind of make a spectrum of, well, here's, everything's groovy, kumbaya, and here's the world is dying. Where on that is our baseline for when we talk about it? And if you can show the community that you're spending, you're up here in crisis level before you ever talk about stuff, that's a lot of time and energy that you're using bottling up and dealing with negative feedback inside yourself and not in others. And there's a measurable cost to that, to your organization or your group or your community. And that you're paying this cost for a sucky experience. Why are we doing this? This is a terrible plan. And once you just reflect that back, oh my goodness, I'm empowered with the knowledge of what my discomfort or our mutual discomfort is actually costing us. Like you can see if you're on a negative balance or on a positive balance. And once that reframing happens, 5 to 6 times out of 10, the group goes, wow, we could be doing this better. And self-generates ideas about what would it look like to not spend 20 minutes checking in with my coworker? What would I need to not have to do that? Oh, I'd need, this, that, and the other thing. And then you can start the dialogue from there once you kind of have it outside yourself and up somewhere where you can look back at it. So that's a thing that can help.
Yeah. I just remembered something else that we used to do where I live. We used to have what we called feelings meetings regularly, once a month. And they weren't about emotional check-ins necessarily. Maybe once a year we'd do some sort of deep check-ins. But it was more like, every time it was something different. Sometimes it was visioning for the future for us as a whole. Sometimes it was support for one person who was going through something. But it wasn't structured as being about conflict or about difficult things. It was a little bit of whatever seemed relevant in the moment or whatever kind of process was coming through the group. And that's also another way to make it very normal to talk about things, but not talk about things that are necessarily difficult. Sometimes it was things that were really easy to talk about, but we all wanted to hear from each other.
Anything else on this front? Okay, I think it's probably our last question. So go ahead.
One thing we talked a lot about is that stage of identifying and then providing feedback and then taking some action. And what I've often seen is that all those things can happen very well, and then there's not necessarily any kind of outcome measurement, and there's not any kind of follow through where we say like, okay, that happened 2 weeks ago. How are we doing now? Or is this problem coming back? Or so how do you think about that follow through after the fact and that outcome measurement within the context of your different communities?
Definitely. So to paraphrase, in situations where even you've gone through it, you've gotten all the way to action, and you're like, yes, we're doing this. How do you capture and make sure that the follow through and then outcomes are actually captured, measured, and mean something? Great question. Thoughts?
One thing you can do is create an outline. Say it's about like someone's behavior. You can make a list of like behavior that is not acceptable or behaviors that you're wanting to see, and you can like just have those written down, have those known, have those shared with all the people that are being affected, and that can kind of add it in, like, we know what this is, we know what it looks like. If it's behavior that's really unacceptable, you can create a strike system. And if that behavior is witnessed or felt, then it starts to add up into, like, something that's going to be a real review or maybe set of consequences. Another thing you can do is set a timeline for like this step needs to happen and then this step needs to happen. And so like in a week, this needs to happen. If it hasn't happened in a week, that's a strike. And you can build that in. And that's a really concrete way to help somebody through a process.
This is a somewhat more general response. We're talking about accountability processes, but I'm also realizing we're talking about community in a broad sense. And some of these communities has very, very clear boundaries about who's in the community and who's not. And some of them just are very amorphous. And a lot of these answers we're giving and the questions are rooted in one or the other. So I just want to name that distinction between the different kind of communities and different kinds of processes and what's possible.
In this one, context is particularly important because the degree to which you are close to someone or economically or socially entangled with someone, like those all bring different levels of both possibility and cost, right? So context is incredibly important in this. It's perhaps the determinant of what you should start to try and do. Big second to everything Jay said. One thing that I want to add is that you need to, as a community or group, have a backup plan for your backup plan. So what happens when they don't do it right and you've done 3 strikes and they still hold the keys to the house? Like, what do you do when enforcement, what is your strategy tree for if this person does this or doesn't do this? What's your next level? And sometimes that just looks like, okay, then we'll have a meeting 3 days later. You know, it just looks like having a plan for how to deal with it. You don't have to come up with what we're going to do, but just acknowledging that shit might not go right in this way, and it might not go right in this way, and then it might go right in this, and this way. And just having a loose idea that you're in for a multiplicity of possibilities and that you've got a plan for dealing with most of them. Because that's where I see a lot of communities stumble and fall, is they didn't plan for that one thing, and nobody in the group talked about it, and then suddenly a decision got made and it's over. And that is a stumbling block that brings them right back to the beginning again 6 months later with all the emotional costs that doing it over entails. So pre-planning as much as you can in group, helpful.
These strike me as great ideas when there are structures in place to name them, categorize them, track them, meetings are held, consequences can be enforced if need be. And not all of us have communities where that's possible. My mind comes to what are more organic forms, And this can't really be imposed on a community. It might not be everyone's cup of tea. But I found it very useful to be within a small group of people, very small, a subset of my community. We get together twice a month. And it's become an intimate enough group that if somebody has an issue for which they want accountability or the group feels they need accountability, there's an informal occasion, in my case on the first and third Tuesday of every month, where a handful of my buddies, seasoned over time, we probably have a safe enough container to allow that. I have an idea the world would be a better place if more people were engaged in regular small groups that are intimate and have built trust. But it won't be everyone's cup of tea.
We are just about out of time. Since we want to take a few minutes to do a closing. And I wanted to close with the observation that a community can be yourself as well. And what we had discussed doing for our closing was to kind of get, I call it a temperature check of like how people feel about this, because we are interested in having some more discussions along these lines with ERIE. And so we'd like to see if there's interest from this group of folks in maybe having another one of these in the fall. So if that interests you, if you have some ideas for how we could do it, whatever that is, just raise your hands. Like to see.
Straw poll.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so October, probably. We'll try to keep folks in the loop. A feelings meeting. Yeah.
That's immediate enactment of structure right there. It's so good.
Yeah, so I want to say thank you, everybody. Really appreciate hearing all your thoughts. Amazing questions, great sharing, intergenerational, intercommunity, really special. Anybody else got anything?
Thank you so much. This is a really important dialogue to be happening. Really, 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 really important. And it's totally my geek. And I just got to spend 2 hours on it. Thank you.